It's a strange fact that beneath the dusty plains of modern-day Iraq lies the buried heart of what we consider civilization, a place where people first gathered in numbers that would make a modern-day city planner blink. Imagine a world where the very idea of a city was being invented, not just built, but conceived in the minds of early humans. Picture vast, fertile floodplains fed by the ancient arteries of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place where the air shimmered with heat and the promise of endless bounty. It was here, in this primordial landscape, that Uruk began its silent, steady march towards greatness, a journey that would redefine human settlement and society forever. The mysteries of its origin, the forgotten names of its earliest inhabitants, linger in the air like a phantom whisper, even as we unearth their meticulously crafted tools and the faint outlines of their first permanent homes. They walked this ground, breathed this air, and left behind an indelible mark, shaping a future they could never have truly imagined. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. So let's drift back to a time long before written history, when the first whispers of communal living began to echo across the southern Mesopotamian plains, around the 6th millennium BCE. In these distant epochs, small scattered settlements, barely more than clusters of reed huts and simple mud brick dwellings, dotted the landscape. These were not cities, not yet, but the nascent sparks of what would become Uruk were already smoldering. Picture a collection of independent villages, each a tiny universe unto itself, sustained by the generous, albeit unpredictable flow of the Euphrates. The river, a life-giver and sometimes a destroyer, deposited rich alluvial silts, transforming arid earth into incredibly fertile farmland. This wasn't farming as we know it today. With precise irrigation systems and genetically modified crops. This was a constant negotiation with nature, a delicate dance of planting and harvesting in the wake of the river's ebb and flow. The people of these early settlements, Proto-Urukians, if you will, were mastering the fundamental skills necessary for survival. Cultivating barley and wheat, herding goats and sheep, and learning to manage the erratic floods that could bring both prosperity and ruin. Life was communal, driven by necessity and the shared struggle against the elements. There were no grand temples, no imposing walls, just the collective effort of small groups of people trying to make a living from the land. But even in these humble beginnings, a subtle shift was occurring. As agricultural techniques improved, perhaps a bit of trial and error here, a fortunate observation there, the surplus of food began to grow. And with surplus came the first glimmerings of something more complex than simple subsistence. The possibility of supporting individuals who didn't spend every waking hour tilling fields or tending flocks. Think of it like this. If everyone has to farm all day, every day, there's no one free to invent the wheel or design a better plow, or even just sit around and think really hard about how to organize society. Archaeological evidence, a language of shattered pottery and half-buried foundations, tells us that these early settlements, though small, were slowly becoming more interconnected. There's a fascinating theory, still debated among scholars, that the very act of managing the complex irrigation systems necessary for large-scale agriculture might have been a catalyst for greater social organization. Imagine dozens of small communities, each needing to ensure water flowed to their fields, but also needing to prevent it from flooding their neighbors. It's a logistical nightmare, right? So perhaps a primitive form of cooperation, of shared decision-making, began to emerge out of sheer practical need. It's like a prehistoric neighborhood watch, but for water. This wasn't centralized power as we understand it. Not yet. But a slow, organic process where communities began to see the benefit of working together on a larger scale. The early pottery found in these sites, often undecorated and utilitarian, speaks volumes about the priorities of the time. These weren't artistic masterpieces. They were tools for storage, for cooking, for the daily grind of survival. Yet, even in their simplicity, they show a progression, a gradual refinement of technique that hints at developing skills and perhaps even early specialization. Someone, somewhere, was getting really good at making pots, and others were getting really good at farming, and slowly, imperceptibly, the division of labor, the bedrock of complex societies, was starting to form. These were the seeds, tiny and almost invisible, of the urban revolution that would explode in Uruk. The vast stretches of open land, once sparsely populated, were slowly, steadily, filling with the hum of human activity, the rhythm of life accelerating with each passing generation. The foundational layers of mud brick that would eventually support monumental structures were being laid, one simple dwelling at a time, across centuries of diligent effort. As those scattered early settlements began to coalesce, the stage was set for the Ubaid period, a fascinating chapter in Mesopotamian prehistory, roughly spanning from 6500 to 4100 BCE. This wasn't just a time of quiet growth. It was a period where the fundamental building blocks of complex society were being meticulously, almost painstakingly, assembled, like a colossal slow-motion Lego project. Imagine tiny villages, once isolated, now beginning to form connections, sharing not just ideas, but also distinctive pottery styles that archaeologists today can trace across vast distances. This widespread, relatively uniform pottery, often a buff-colored ware with geometric designs painted in dark brown or black, is a hallmark of the Ubaid culture. It's almost like everyone suddenly decided that stripes and zigzags were the fashion statement for their ceramic wares. During the Ubaid period, the improvements in agricultural sophistication truly began to take hold. We are talking about more than just throwing seeds on the ground and hoping for the best. This era saw the development of more advanced irrigation techniques, allowing farmers to cultivate larger areas more efficiently and reliably. They were learning to control the volatile Euphrates, not perfectly, but well enough to coax more life from its fertile banks. This meant consistent food surpluses. And as any ancient civilization will tell you, a full belly is the foundation of progress. When people aren't constantly worried about where their next meal is coming from, they have time for other things, like thinking about how to build bigger, better, or perhaps, for the truly ambitious, how to rule over others. With these agricultural advancements came the first clear signs of social stratification. It wasn't an instant transformation into a rigid class system, but rather a gradual emergence of differences in wealth and status. Think of it like a subtle ripple effect. If one family consistently produces more grain than another, they start to accumulate more resources. Over generations, this accumulation can translate into greater influence and power. Archaeological digs from U.S.A sites reveal larger, more elaborate houses for some families, alongside smaller, simpler dwellings for others. Grave goods also tell a story. Some burials contain more valuable items, indicating that not everyone was treated equally in death, suggesting they weren't equal in life either. It's like finding a prehistoric trust fund baby. Another critical development was the rise of temple structures. These weren't just simple shrines. They were increasingly large and elaborate buildings, often situated on raised platforms, suggesting their growing importance within the community. These early temples, built of mud brick, served as more than just places of worship. They likely functioned as communal storehouses for surplus goods, centers for redistribution, and perhaps even early administrative hubs. Imagine a village elder or a particularly charismatic individual taking on the role of overseeing the temple's resources. This person, with religious authority and control over the community's wealth, would naturally gain significant influence. It's the ancient equivalent of being both the pastor and the bank manager. A pretty sweet deal, if you ask me. These emerging religious and administrative centers became focal points for population aggregation. People naturally gravitated towards places that offered security, shared resources, and spiritual guidance. The scattered small villages began to merge, or perhaps new settlements grew up around these increasingly prominent temple complexes. This wasn't a forced migration, but a natural magnetic pull towards a centralizing force. You can almost imagine someone saying, "Hey, they've got better irrigation and a bigger temple over there. Let's move." And so, slowly but surely, the population density began to increase in certain favored locations. While the Ubaid period didn't give us the sprawling megalopolis that Uruk would become, it laid the essential groundwork. It perfected the agricultural techniques needed to support a large, non-farming population, developed the initial forms of social hierarchy necessary for organized labor, and established the temple as a central institution for both spiritual and temporal power. Without these foundational steps, Uruk's later explosion onto the historical scene would have been impossible. It's like the quiet, methodical work of laying rebar before pouring the concrete for a skyscraper. You don't see it when the building is finished, but it's absolutely crucial. The shift from scattered, egalitarian farming communities to more centralized, hierarchically organized proto-urban centers was subtle, almost imperceptible to those living through it. But it was profoundly transformative. The very idea of a shared public space, of collective enterprise beyond the family unit, was being forged in the heat of Mesopotamian summers and the cool damp of its fertile fields. Out of the fertile crucible of the Ubaid period, where the whispers of early communal living were slowly growing into a murmur, a truly transformative development began to take shape in southern Mesopotamia, particularly at the site that would one day be called Uruk, the rise of the Iana and Anu districts. Imagine, if you will, not just one, but two monumental centers emerging within the nascent city, each dedicated to a powerful deity, each vying, perhaps subtly, for influence, and together forming the very heart and soul of Uruk. This wasn't a sudden architectural epiphany. It was the culmination of centuries of gradual accretion, of rebuilding older, smaller shrines into something truly awe-inspiring. It's like upgrading your garden shed into a full-blown mansion, and then deciding you need a second, even grander mansion right next door, just for good measure. The Iana district, dedicated to Inanna, later Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, and fertility, was arguably the more prominent, and certainly the more archaeologically impressive of the two. Think of Inanna as the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of a celebrity influencer, but with actual divine powers and a penchant for monumental architecture. As settlements around Uruk grew, so too did the devotion to Inanna, manifesting in increasingly elaborate temple complexes. These weren't just simple mud brick rooms anymore. They were vast, intricate structures, often built on immense platforms, with courtyards, halls, and countless chambers. The sheer scale of these constructions suggests a level of organized labor and communal effort that was unprecedented. Imagine thousands of people, organized into work gangs, digging, hauling, and laying millions of mud bricks under the relentless Mesopotamian sun. It's hard work, folks, and it points to a very persuasive authority figure, or figures, indeed. Concurrently, the Anu district was developing, dedicated to Anu, the sky god, considered the supreme deity in the Sumerian pantheon. While perhaps less explored archaeologically than Iana, the Anu district, with its white temple perched atop the monumental ziggurat of Anu, later Iana, still represents an incredible feat of early engineering and religious devotion. The white temple, so named for its whitewashed walls, would have gleamed in the sunlight, a beacon visible for miles across the flat plains. The fact that it was built on such a high platform, a proto-ziggurat, suggests a desire to literally reach for the heavens, to connect with the divine in a tangible, imposing way. It's a bit like building your church on the highest hill in town, just to make sure God doesn't miss it. These two districts served as much more than just religious centers. They were the initial roles as religious and administrative centers of Uruk, blurring the lines between the sacred and the secular in a way that is profoundly alien to modern sensibilities. The temples acted as colossal economic engines. They owned vast tracts of land, employed armies of laborers, artisans, and scribes, and managed the distribution of resources. Think of them as the ancient world's combination of a church, a bank, a factory, and the local government office, all rolled into one impressive package. Surplus agricultural produce, collected as offerings or taxes, was stored in temple granaries, providing a buffer against lean times and a source of wealth for civic projects. This centralized control over resources allowed for the funding of even grander construction projects, creating a feedback loop of increasing power and complexity. One fascinating aspect, still a subject of scholarly debate, is the exact relationship between these two powerful districts. Were they cooperative, working in tandem for the greater good of Uruk? Or was there a subtle rivalry, a kind of ancient urban competition to see whose god had the bigger, shinier temple? The archaeological record doesn't give us clear answers, but the presence of two distinct monumental centers suggests a complex power dynamic at play, perhaps a balance of religious authority that prevented any single faction from gaining absolute control. It's like having two major universities in one city, each with its own prestige and patronage, both contributing to the overall intellectual vibrancy, but perhaps also occasionally elbowing each other for top ranking. The very act of constructing these monumental complexes required unprecedented levels of organization. Someone had to plan the buildings, someone had to supervise the labor, someone had to ensure that the millions of mud bricks were made and transported. This demand for coordination likely spurred the development of early administrative structures, the very precursors to bureaucracy and formal governance. The temples, therefore, weren't just reflections of Uruk's growing power. They were also the engines that drove it, forcing the evolution of new societal structures to manage the sheer scale of their ambition. Their rising walls symbolized not just devotion, but the ascent of Uruk itself from a cluster of villages to a true urban marvel. As the monumental Iana and Anu districts rose, transforming Uruk's skyline, another, perhaps less visually dramatic, yet equally revolutionary, change was sweeping through its workshops: the ceramic revolution and specialization. While massive temples grab headlines, it was often the humble pottery, a seemingly mundane aspect of daily life, that quietly signaled profound shifts in economic and societal organization. Imagine, if you will, the bustling, smoky workshops of ancient Uruk, not just a few potters crafting individual artistic pieces, but rather an assembly line of sorts, churning out thousands upon thousands of utilitarian vessels. This was a direct departure from the earlier, more individualized pottery traditions, and it points to a city rapidly scaling up its production capacity. It's like going from bespoke, handcrafted mugs to an entire warehouse full of identical, mass-produced coffee cups. Less charming, perhaps, but incredibly efficient for a rapidly growing population. The star of this ceramic revolution was undoubtedly the bevel-rimmed bowl. Now, if you're picturing something delicate and exquisitely painted, you'd be hilariously mistaken. The bevel-rimmed bowl was the ancient world's disposable fast food container. It was a crude, thick-walled, unpainted, conical vessel, often with a distinctive bevel cut around its rim, hence the name. These bowls were almost certainly made in molds, or at least very rapidly formed by hand, indicating a production method geared towards speed and volume rather than aesthetic appeal. They are found in astonishing numbers at Uruk and other Uruk-influenced sites, often in layers upon layers, suggesting they were used once or a few times and then discarded. Think of them as the styrofoam cups of the 4th millennium BCE. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but supremely practical. The sheer proliferation of these bowls signaled Uruk's economic and societal shifts in several crucial ways. Firstly, their standardized size and ubiquitous presence strongly suggest they were used for rationing or distributing food portions to a large labor force. Picture thousands of workers, perhaps engaged in the colossal task of building those temples or ziggurats we just discussed, needing to be fed quickly and efficiently. A fixed-size bowl would be perfect for handing out daily rations of grain or gruel. This implies a highly organized system of labor management, where a central authority, likely the temple administration, was responsible for feeding its workers. It's the ancient equivalent of a company cafeteria, but with less variety and probably no dessert. Secondly, the mass production of these bowls points directly to specialization of labor. No longer was every household making its own pottery. Instead, there were dedicated potters, or groups of potters, whose sole job was to churn out these functional vessels. This freed up other members of society to focus on other tasks: farming, building, administration, even perhaps early forms of bureaucratic accounting. This division of labor is a cornerstone of complex societies, allowing for greater efficiency and the accumulation of specialized knowledge and skills. It's a classic example of how solving a practical problem, how to feed a lot of people, can have profound unintended consequences for societal structure. Furthermore, the widespread distribution of these bevel-rimmed bowls beyond Uruk itself, found at distant sites associated with the Uruk expansion, suggests their role as a kind of cultural identifier or administrative tool. They weren't just for Uruk's internal consumption. They were part of the Uruk package that traveled with its influence, whether they were used to provision Urukian envoys, laborers sent abroad, or even as a simple, recognizable symbol of Uruk's administrative reach. Their presence is a clear archaeological marker of the city's extensive network. A fascinating, still debated, historiographic mystery surrounding these bowls is their exact purpose. While rationing is the lead-in theory, some scholars suggest they might also have been used for baking bread, for ritual purposes, or even as molds for other objects. The truth is, we don't have a definitive bevel-rimmed bowl user manual from 3500 BCE. However, their sheer quantity and utilitarian nature make a strong case for their role in large-scale, centrally managed economy. What is clear is that they represent a technological and organizational leap, a stark indicator of Uruk's shift from a collection of self-sufficient villages to a truly urban, highly structured society, capable of mobilizing vast human resources. This seemingly simple piece of pottery tells a complex story of power, organization, and the daily lives of thousands of people working to build the world's first true city, from the burgeoning workshops churning out endless bevel-rimmed bowls. A profound transformation was rapidly unfolding across Uruk's landscape. The explosive urbanization and population growth. Imagine, in a relatively short span of centuries, a collection of humble agricultural settlements swelling into a sprawling, vibrant metropolis. A city whose very existence redefined what human habitation could be. This wasn't merely incremental expansion. It was a phenomenon, a magnet drawing people from the surrounding countryside like iron filings to a powerful force, creating what many scholars consider the world's first true city. The transition from scattered villages to a densely populated urban center was a dizzying acceleration of human history, a process that still fascinates and perplexes archaeologists today. It's like watching a quiet rural town suddenly become a bustling megacity, seemingly overnight, driven by some invisible, irresistible current. By the late 4th millennium BCE, particularly during the Uruk-hai and the Thrid periods, roughly 3500–3100 BCE, Uruk reached truly astonishing dimensions. While exact population figures are always estimates, the archaeological evidence points to an unprecedented concentration of people. Imagine a city that, at its peak, encompassed an area of 500 to 600 hectares. That's about 1,200 to 1,500 acres, encircled by massive defensive walls that stretched for miles. To put that into perspective, that's larger than many European capitals, well into the medieval period. Within those walls, estimates range from 40,000 to 80,000 inhabitants, and some even propose figures exceeding 100,000. Just picture the sheer density of life, the constant hum of activity, the mingling of thousands of voices, the smells of cooking fires and crowded markets. This was no sleepy village. This was a living, breathing, pulsing urban organism. The transformation from a collection of villages into a densely populated urban center wasn't accidental. Several factors converged to fuel this extraordinary growth. The previously discussed advancements in agriculture, especially the refined irrigation techniques of the U.S.A. period, created a consistent and abundant food surplus. This surplus could feed a large non-farming population, freeing up individuals to specialize in crafts, administration, and religious duties. As the temples grew in power and wealth, they attracted more people, not just as worshippers, but as laborers, artisans, and administrators. The promise of work, of community, of security behind those increasingly formidable walls must have been a powerful draw for those living in less protected rural areas. It's the ancient version of moving to the big city for better opportunities. Only instead of skyscrapers, you're looking at towering ziggurats. This dramatic population influx led to profound changes in the very fabric of society. The close-knit, kinship-based structures of villages began to give way to more complex, anonymous social relationships characteristic of urban life. Imagine the challenge of governing such a diverse and rapidly expanding populace. New systems of social control, dispute resolution, and resource allocation became essential. The temple administration, already central to Uruk's economy, likely expanded its bureaucratic apparatus to manage the needs of this vast urban population. This included everything from organizing the provision of water and food to maintaining public order and coordinating monumental building projects. One of the interesting scholarly debates surrounding Uruk's urbanization concerns whether the growth was primarily organic, driven by internal demographic forces and economic pull, or if there was an element of coerced centralization, perhaps a powerful elite forcing rural populations to move into the city for better control and labor mobilization. While it's difficult to definitively prove coercion, the scale of some of the monumental projects, like the city walls, certainly suggests a powerful central authority capable of commanding vast human resources. It's probably a combination of both. People were attracted by opportunity, but once there, they were integrated into a highly organized and likely hierarchical system. The sheer density of living within Uruk also had significant implications for public health, sanitation, and social interaction. While we don't have detailed health records from 3000 BCE, it's safe to assume that disease spread quickly in such crowded conditions. Yet the city persisted and thrived, a testament to the organizational capacity of its inhabitants. The urban environment itself spurred innovation, creating a dynamic crucible where ideas, technologies, and social structures could rapidly evolve. Uruk was not just a collection of buildings. It was a vibrant, pulsing ecosystem where civilization, as we know it, was truly taking its first confident steps. With Uruk's population swelling and its societal structures solidifying, the natural next step in its meteoric rise was the emergence of monumental architecture. Imagine, if you will, the sheer audacity of it, building structures so vast, so elaborate, that they would dwarf anything seen before. testifying not just to wealth and power, but to an unshakable belief in the divine and the collective might of an organized populace. This wasn't just about putting a roof over someone's head. It was about shaping the very landscape, creating symbols of power that could be seen for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plains. These colossal temples and ziggurats were the ancient world's skyscrapers, proclaiming Uruk's burgeoning power to anyone who might gaze upon them. The construction of Uruk's colossal temples and ziggurats represents an astounding feat of ancient engineering, especially given the limited technology available. We're talking about the late 4th millennium BCE, remember? No steel girders, no concrete mixers, no bulldozers. Everything was built with human labor, simple tools, and the humble, yet incredibly versatile, mud brick. Kilns were used for some specialized bricks, but the vast majority were sun-dried, requiring immense quantities of clay, straw, and water, mixed by hand and pressed into molds, then left to bake under the relentless sun. Picture thousands of people, day in and day out, engaged in this labor-intensive process. Their hands caked with mud, their backs aching from the endless toil. It's hard to complain about modern construction delays when you consider what they accomplished with just grit and elbow grease. The most famous of these structures are found in the Iana district, dedicated to Inanna. Here, archaeologists have unearthed successive layers of awe-inspiring buildings, each grander than the last. The limestone temple, for example, was a massive structure built on a raised platform, its walls constructed from imported limestone blocks, a clear indication of Uruk's ability to mobilize resources from significant distances. Then there's the Cone Mosaic Temple, its exterior decorated with thousands upon thousands of small colored clay cones pressed into the mud plaster, creating intricate geometric patterns. Imagine the dizzying, painstaking work involved in placing each one of those cones by hand, day after day. It must have been a job that required both extreme patience and a complete lack of vertigo. But perhaps the most iconic symbol of Uruk's architectural prowess is the White Temple, perched atop the ziggurat of Anu. While the ziggurat itself was likely a stepped platform rather than a true multi-tiered pyramid in this early stage, its sheer height and mass were immense. The temple at its summit, whitewashed to brilliant effect, would have been a beacon. Visible from far away, the effort required to build such a structure, transporting all that mud brick, elevating it piece by piece to such a height, speaks volumes about the centralized organization and power of Uruk's leadership. It wasn't just about faith, it was about projecting power, both divine and earthly. These structures were not merely religious buildings. They were the heart of Uruk's urban identity, embodying its burgeoning power. Their scale alone would have instilled a sense of awe and reverence in the populace, reinforcing the authority of the priests and rulers who presided over them. They were also powerful symbols to rival city-states and distant polities, silently proclaiming Uruk's economic might and its capacity for organized collective action. "Look what we can build," they seem to say. "Imagine what else we can do." This architectural display was a form of ancient soft power, communicating Uruk's dominance without firing a single arrow. A significant scholarly debate revolves around the precise function of these early monumental temples. While their religious significance is undeniable, Their role in the city's economic and administrative life is equally crucial. Were they primarily centers for cult and ritual, with economic functions as a secondary aspect? Or were they primarily economic powerhouses with religious ideology serving to legitimize and reinforce their administrative control? The truth, as often is the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle, a complex interweaving of spiritual belief and practical governance. The temples likely served as central granaries, workshops, and administrative offices, employing vast numbers of people and managing the distribution of goods and resources across the city and its surrounding agricultural lands. Their very size necessitated a complex bureaucracy to manage their daily operations, a system that foreshadowed much later governmental structures. The air around these towering edifices would have hummed not just with prayers, but with the sounds of commerce, construction, and bureaucratic pronouncements, a vibrant testament to a city truly coming into its own. As Uruk's colossal temples pierced the sky and its population swelled, an even more fundamental revolution was quietly, almost imperceptibly, taking hold within the temple administrations and burgeoning economic centers. The birth of writing, specifically proto-cuneiform. Imagine a time when knowledge and transactions were confined to the limits of human memory or simple verbal agreements. Suddenly, a new technology emerges that allows information to be recorded, stored, and transmitted with unprecedented accuracy and permanence. This wasn't some sudden flash of genius, a eureka moment for a lone inventor. It was a slow, practical evolution, driven by the sheer complexity of managing Uruk's vast economy and its monumental projects. The story of writing begins not with poetry or epic tales, but with ledgers and receipts, because even back then, someone needed to keep track of who owed what to whom. The need for a system to manage the immense quantities of goods flowing through Uruk's temple complexes became overwhelming. How do you track thousands of sheep, countless bushels of barley, or hundreds of laborers without a reliable method of record keeping? Oral traditions simply couldn't cope with the scale. Enter the earliest forms of writing, initially appearing in the late 4th millennium BCE during Uruk's Uruk IV period. These initial attempts were not sophisticated literary works. They were purely utilitarian, economic documents. They were the world's first spreadsheets, meticulously tracking inputs and outputs. The evolution of proto-cuneiform began with simple pictograms. Picture a basic drawing of a head to represent a person, an ear of barley for grain, or a stylized ox head for cattle. These were direct representations of objects. If you wanted to record 5 sheep, you'd draw 5 sheep. Simple enough, right? But what if you wanted to record 5 dead sheep, or 5 sheep delivered? The system quickly became cumbersome and ambiguous. This is where the brilliant, yet entirely practical, innovation began. Over time, these pictograms began to become more abstract and stylized, losing their direct resemblance to the objects they represented. This was partly for efficiency. It's much quicker to draw a few lines than a detailed picture of a sheep. But more importantly, the signs started to represent not just objects, but also sounds or concepts. This crucial step, known as the rebus principle, was a game changer. For example, a drawing of an arrow, pronounced tai in Sumerian, could also represent the word life, also tai. It's like if in English A picture of a bee could also mean the verb be. This allowed for the representation of abstract ideas, grammatical elements, and even personal names, moving writing beyond simple accounting. The clay tablets, impressed with a stylus, transformed from pictures into a system of wedge-shaped marks. The very essence of cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, the primary function of these early written texts was unequivocally administrative. We find lists of goods, records of transactions, tallies of laborers, and inventories of temple property. These tablets paint a vivid, if dry, picture of Uruk's bustling economic life. They reveal a highly centralized economy, where the temple acted as a massive redistribution center, collecting goods and then dispensing them as wages or rations. This level of bureaucratic organization would have been impossible without writing. Imagine trying to run a multi-million-dollar corporation with no computers, no paper, and no memory beyond what a few people could hold in their heads. It simply wouldn't work. A fascinating scholarly debate concerns the literacy rates in early Uruk. Was writing a specialized skill held by a small elite of scribes, or was there a broader understanding of these signs among the general populace, at least for basic transactions? While complex literary texts were certainly the domain of trained scribes, the utilitarian nature and widespread use of proto-cuneiform for daily economic activities suggest that a basic level of comprehension might have been more common than previously thought. It's like understanding traffic signs. You don't need to be an engineer to know what a stop sign means. This new tool, born out of necessity, not intellectual curiosity, fundamentally altered the cognitive landscape of Uruk. It allowed for the accumulation of knowledge, the standardization of procedures, and the creation of a vast, interconnected administrative network that stretched far beyond the city walls. The scratching of a reed stylus on wet clay laid the very foundation for history itself, with writing taking its first hesitant, then confident, steps in Uruk's administrative halls. A far broader phenomenon was simultaneously unfolding, the Uruk expansion phenomenon. Imagine Uruk not just as a thriving metropolis, but as a radiating cultural and economic powerhouse, its influence extending far beyond its massive walls, touching distant lands, and profoundly reshaping the ancient Near East. This wasn't necessarily a military conquest in the traditional sense, though military might certainly wasn't out of the question. Rather, it was a complex process of cultural diffusion, trade networks, and perhaps even colonial-style outposts, spreading Uruk's sophisticated urban model across Mesopotamia and beyond. It's like a prehistoric version of cultural globalization. But instead of pop music and fast food, they were exporting administrative techniques, architectural styles, and those ever-present bevel-rimmed bowls. Beginning in the Middle and Late Uruk periods, roughly 3500–3100 BCE, evidence of Uruk's reach appears across a vast geographical area. From northern Mesopotamia, modern-day Syria and Turkey, to southwestern Iran, archaeological sites reveal clear Urukian characteristics. We're talking about distinctive pottery, specific architectural layouts, administrative tablets, and even specific types of seals. It's like finding a consistent brand label across a huge variety of ancient goods, indicating a common origin or pervasive influence. This widespread material culture provides compelling evidence that Uruk was not an isolated marvel, but rather the heart of a truly extensive network. The spread of Uruk's cultural and economic model took various forms. One prominent theory suggests the establishment of trading colonies or outposts. Imagine small groups of Urukian merchants, scribes, and administrators venturing out from the homeland, settling in strategically important locations along major trade routes. These outposts, like Habuba Kabira and Jebel Aruda in Syria, were not simply local villages. They were deliberately planned settlements, often with clear Urukian architectural styles, monumental buildings, albeit on a smaller scale than Uruk itself, and distinctive Urukian artifacts. They functioned as nodes in a vast economic network, facilitating the procurement of raw materials that Uruk lacked, such as timber, metals, and precious stones. It's like setting up supply chain hubs in resource-rich areas, ensuring a steady flow back to the industrial heartland. Another aspect of the expansion was the diffusion of ideas and technologies. Local cultures, witnessing the advanced administrative techniques, monumental architecture, and the sheer organizational power of Uruk, may have adopted elements of the Urukian model. This could have been through direct interaction, emulation, or even a desire to participate in Uruk's prosperous economic sphere. The concept of writing, for instance, which originated in Uruk, eventually spread across Mesopotamia, though local adaptations and innovations certainly occurred. It's akin to how modern business practices or technologies spread globally, adopted and adapted by different regions. A significant historiographic mystery and ongoing scholarly debate centers on the exact nature of this expansion. Was it primarily driven by peaceful trade and cultural exchange, a kind of benign hegemon shaping its world through soft power? Or was there an underlying element of coercion, of Uruk flexing its considerable economic and perhaps even military muscle to ensure its access to vital resources? While direct evidence of large-scale military conquest is scarce for this period, it's difficult to imagine such an extensive and powerful network operating without some degree of political leverage or the implicit threat of force. The Uruk state was highly organized and clearly capable of mobilizing large populations, so it's not unreasonable to assume they could field an army if necessary. Regardless of the precise mechanisms, the Uruk expansion had a profound and lasting impact on the ancient Near East. It helped to spread the concepts of urbanism, monumental architecture, advanced administration, and writing to diverse regions, laying the groundwork for subsequent civilizations. The very idea of a complex, stratified society centered around large cities with specialized labor and extensive trade networks was solidified and propagated by Uruk's example. The ripple effects of Uruk's influence would be felt for centuries, demonstrating that even in an age without mass media, the power of a successful model could travel vast distances. The sprawling reach of Uruk's influence created a shared cultural horizon, a network of interdependencies that knitted together distant lands and laid the initial threads of a truly interconnected ancient world. As Uruk's influence radiated outwards through the Uruk expansion, the logistical demands of supporting its burgeoning urban population and monumental projects became immense, leading to the development of sophisticated trade networks and resource acquisition strategies. Imagine a city that, despite its fertile agricultural heartland, lacked many of the essential raw materials necessary for its advanced crafts its monumental architecture, and even its daily life, no major sources of timber for roofs and tools, no copper for implements, no gold or lapis lazuli for adornments that symbolized status and religious devotion. Uruk became a colossal engine, constantly drawing in resources from distant lands, a testament to its organizational genius and its ability to forge connections across a vast geographical expanse. It's like a prehistoric megafactory, constantly needing raw materials to churn out its finished products, from divine statues to humble tools. Uruk's immediate surroundings, while excellent for agriculture, were poor in mineral resources and quality timber. The alluvial plains offered abundant clay for mud bricks and pottery, reeds for construction, and fertile land for crops, but little else. To sustain its growth and maintain its sophisticated lifestyle, Uruk had to look outward. This necessity spurred the development of intricate trade routes, some extending hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. These weren't paved highways with roadside diners, mind you. These were often treacherous paths across deserts, along rivers, or through mountain passes, fraught with dangers from harsh environments and potential banditry. The fact that Uruk managed to establish and maintain these networks speaks volumes about its economic power and political influence. The primary resources Uruk sought were varied and vital. For its monumental buildings, timber was crucial, especially large logs for roofing and structural supports in grand halls. These likely came from the forested mountains of the Zagros to the east, or the Lebanon and Taurus Mountains to the northwest. Imagine the immense effort required to fell these trees, fashion them into usable logs, and then transport them, perhaps by floating them down rivers or dragging them across vast stretches of land, all the way back to Uruk. It was a logistical nightmare that they somehow made work. Metals were another critical commodity. Copper, used for tools, weapons, and early implements, likely came from regions like Oman, Anatolia, or the Iranian plateau. Gold and silver, though scarcer, were prized for elite objects and offerings. These precious metals often traveled even greater distances, perhaps through multiple intermediaries, each taking their cut along the way. Think of the ancient version of a global supply chain, but without cargo ships or container terminals, just donkeys and determination. Beyond timber and metals, Uruk imported a range of other exotic materials. Precious stones like lapis lazuli, a vibrant blue stone prized for jewelry and inlay, which originated almost exclusively from Badakhshan in modern-day Afghanistan, an astonishing distance. Carnelian, obsidian, and various types of stone for cylinder seals also flowed into the city. These materials not only served practical purposes, but also symbolized status and facilitated the religious and administrative functions of the city. Owning a piece of lapis lazuli was like flashing a designer watch today. It instantly communicated wealth and connection. The mechanisms of this trade were complex, while direct expeditions by Urukian agents certainly occurred, especially to establish colonies during the Uruk expansion. Much of the trade likely involved intermediaries. Local communities along the trade routes would have acted as transporters, traders, and suppliers, creating a web of economic relationships. The invention of writing played a crucial role here. Administrative tablets from Uruk detail various transactions, demonstrating the bureaucratic oversight of these far-flung economic ventures. This allows scholars to trace albeit sometimes speculatively. The flow of goods and the organization behind it, a fascinating mainstream historical fact often discussed, is how the cylinder seal, an invention of the Uruk period, became an indispensable tool for managing these vast networks. These small carved stone cylinders, when rolled over wet clay, left a unique impression, acting as a signature, a mark of ownership, or a way to secure goods. Imagine a warehouse full of goods, each sealed with a distinctive impression, ensuring accountability and preventing tampering. This simple invention was a cornerstone of early commerce and administration, without which such extensive trade might have been impossible. The meticulousness required to manage such a complex web of exchange highlights Uruk's extraordinary capacity for organization, a capacity that allowed it to transform raw materials from distant mountains and deserts into the very fabric of its burgeoning civilization, as Uruk's trade networks hummed with activity, drawing in vital resources from distant lands. The internal structure of the city was simultaneously evolving into an intricate tapestry of specialized roles and distinct social strata. This was the era of the social hierarchy and labor organization taking definitive shape, transforming Uruk from a mere collection of people into a highly structured, almost machine-like urban system. Imagine a city where everyone knew their place, from the lowliest laborer shaping mud bricks under the relentless sun, to the powerful priests and administrators who directed the monumental endeavors. This wasn't simply a matter of rich and poor. It was a complex system of interdependence, where specialized skills and positions contributed to the functioning of the entire urban organism. It's a bit like a highly complex clock, where every tiny gear and spring has a specific job, and the whole mechanism relies on them all working in concert. At the apex of this burgeoning hierarchy stood the ruling elite, likely a combination of religious and administrative authorities. These were the individuals who controlled the vast resources of the temples, oversaw the monumental construction projects, and managed the increasingly complex trade networks. Their power was probably legitimized by their perceived connection to the divine, acting as intermediaries between the gods and the human populace. Beneath them were the scribes, a newly emerging and incredibly powerful class. With the invention of proto-cuneiform, scribes were the information managers of Uruk, meticulously recording transactions, inventories, and decrees. Their literacy granted them immense influence, making them indispensable to the functioning of the state. You could almost say they were the ancient world's IT professionals, wielding immense power through their specialized knowledge. Below these elites, Uruk boasted a highly specialized labor force. The sheer scale of construction, the Eana and Anu districts, the city walls, required thousands of dedicated workers. There were the quarrymen, hauling limestone from distant sources, the mud brick makers, churning out millions of bricks, the porters and boatmen, transporting goods, and the countless construction workers, tirelessly building the city's monumental core. But specialization extended beyond construction. We see evidence of full-time potters, their workshops producing the ubiquitous bevel-rimmed bowls and other ceramic wares. There were weavers, metallurgists, jewelers, stone carvers, and agricultural specialists managing the vast temple lands. Each individual or group of individuals focused on a specific task, contributing their expertise to the collective enterprise. This degree of specialization was a direct consequence of the agricultural surplus. When fewer people were needed for direct food production, others were freed up to pursue crafts and services, leading to greater efficiency and higher quality goods. This also fostered a more complex economy, moving beyond simple barter to systems of remuneration, likely involving rations of barley, oil, or wool. The bevel-rimmed bowls, remember, were probably used to distribute these rations, a tangible symbol of the organized system of payment for labor. The emerging class distinctions were not just about wealth, though that was certainly a factor. They were also about status, access to resources, and control over knowledge. While a common laborer might live in a small, simple dwelling, the high priest or a chief administrator would reside in a larger, more comfortable house, adorned with imported goods. Burial practices also reveal these distinctions. Some graves are much richer in grave goods than others, reflecting the social standing of the deceased. This stratification wasn't necessarily fixed. There might have been some degree of social mobility, but the overall trend was towards a more defined hierarchy. A fascinating scholarly debate revolves around the nature of labor mobilization in Uruk. Was the workforce entirely free and compensated, or was there an element of forced labor, corvée duty, or even slavery? While direct evidence for widespread slavery of the chattel type is limited for this early period, it's highly probable that a system of compulsory labor, where citizens owed a certain amount of work to the state, perhaps for a portion of the year, was in place. How else could such massive public works be accomplished without a centralized authority capable of commanding vast human resources? It's unlikely that everyone cheerfully volunteered to dig mud all day, every day, without some form of societal expectation or obligation. The very concept of organized labor on such a grand scale, managed by a burgeoning bureaucracy, represents a foundational shift in human societal organization, establishing precedents for urban life that would echo through millennia, long after Uruk's mud brick walls had crumbled back into the earth. With Uruk's social hierarchies solidifying and its labor force meticulously organized, the very concept of governance took on a new, more centralized form, epitomized by the enigmatic figure of the priest-king and early governance. Imagine a leader who simultaneously embodied the sacred and the secular, whose authority flowed from both divine mandate and practical administrative prowess, ruling over a city that was, in essence, a massive temple economy. This wasn't a separation of church and state. It was a profound fusion where religious ideology provided the ultimate legitimacy for earthly power, and the temple served as the central engine of the city's economic and political life. The priest-king was not merely a ruler. He was the spiritual shepherd and the chief executive officer, all rolled into one impressive, often intimidating package. It's like having a CEO who also claims to have a direct line to the heavens, which, let's be honest, would make those quarterly earnings calls a lot more interesting. The figure of the priest-king, often referred to as the En or Lugal in later Sumerian texts, though the precise terminology for Uruk-Thopot is debated, emerged as the preeminent authority in Uruk during its peak. This leader was not just a political strongman. His power was inextricably linked to the city's patron deity, Inanna for the Yana district, and Anu for the Anu district. He was seen as the earthly steward of the god or goddess, responsible for ensuring divine favor, maintaining the cult, and overseeing the temple's vast estates. His role was to mediate between the human and divine realms, performing elaborate rituals and ensuring the prosperity of the city through proper religious observance. This blend of religious and secular authority was fundamental to Uruk's governance model. Underneath the priest-king, a complex administrative apparatus developed to manage the immense wealth and activity generated by the temple economy. This wasn't a government, as we might understand it today, with distinct ministries and departments, but rather a sprawling bureaucracy centered around the temple institutions. Think of a vast network of administrators, overseers, and scribes, all working to manage the collection of agricultural produce, the organization of labor gangs for monumental construction, the distribution of rations, and the oversight of far-flung trade ventures. The invention of writing, remember, was absolutely crucial here, providing the tools for these early bureaucrats to keep meticulous records of everything. Without those clay tablets, the entire system would have collapsed into chaos. The priest-king's responsibilities were manifold. He was the chief priest, leading rituals and ensuring the proper veneration of the gods. He was the supreme economic manager, directing the flow of goods and resources. He was likely the chief justice, resolving disputes and upholding order within the crowded urban environment. And crucially, he was the commander-in-chief, responsible for the city's defense, especially as Uruk's wealth and influence grew, inevitably attracting the envy of neighboring polities. While direct archaeological evidence for military conflicts during Uruk Fort is limited, the construction of massive city walls suggests a clear awareness of external threats and the need for organized defense. A significant open historiographic mystery surrounds the exact succession of these priest-kings and the precise nature of their authority. Was it hereditary? Were they elected by a council of elders or priests? Did their power evolve from a more communal, less centralized leadership structure? The archaeological record and later Sumerian king lists, which are often legendary in nature, provide tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. For example, the Sumerian king list mentions figures like Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh as early kings of Uruk, blurring the lines between historical fact and mythical narrative. While these figures are often presented as kings, their roles likely encompassed this blend of religious and secular leadership, indicating that the concept of a distinct king, as we understand it, might have been a later development. This early form of governance, where religious and economic power were intertwined and concentrated in the hands of a charismatic leader and his administrative elite, proved remarkably effective for organizing a large, complex urban society. It allowed Uruk to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale, construct its monumental temples, and project its influence across the wider region. It laid the very foundations for the later kingships and empires of Mesopotamia, demonstrating that order, prosperity, and indeed civilization itself could be forged through centralized authority, even if that authority wore a very grand and perhaps slightly absurd tiara. The magnificent efflorescence of Uruk, characterized by its towering temples, sprawling urban plain, and radiating influence, could not, however, last forever in its most expansive form. Just as surely as the sun rises and sets, the decline of the Uruk expansion became an inevitable, if gradual, process, marking a significant shift in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East. Imagine a great wave crashing upon distant shores with immense force, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, receding, leaving behind traces of its passage but no longer exerting its dominant power. The factors contributing to this retraction were complex and multifaceted, ranging from internal pressures within Uruk itself to the burgeoning strength of regional powers that had absorbed, adapted, or simply grown weary of Uruk's pervasive presence. It's like a massive corporate empire that, after years of aggressive growth, suddenly finds itself facing increasing competition and logistical challenges that make its global reach unsustainable. The peak of Uruk's expansion is generally placed in the Uruk IV period, c. 3300–3100 BCE. After this vibrant phase, archaeological evidence suggests a gradual pulling back, a lessening of Uruk's direct control or influence over its more distant outposts. Many of the Urukian-style settlements in regions like northern Mesopotamia and Elam, southwestern Iran, either saw a decrease in Urukian material culture, underwent significant local adaptations, or were simply abandoned. This wasn't a catastrophic collapse overnight, but rather a slow unpicking of the intricate web of connections that Uruk had so painstakingly woven. One of the primary reasons for this retraction was likely regional resistance. As Uruk's model of urbanism, administration, and resource extraction spread, it inevitably encountered existing local polities and populations. While some may have initially welcomed the economic opportunities presented by Uruk's networks, over time, the imposition of Urukian cultural norms, administrative systems, and demands for resources likely generated resentment. Imagine a local chieftain watching Urukian administrators managing his region's resources, or local craftsmen being outcompeted by mass-produced Urukian goods. It's only a matter of time before they start asking, what exactly are we getting out of this arrangement? This could have led to increased friction, localized conflicts, and a desire for greater autonomy among the peripheral regions. Another significant factor was the sheer logistical challenge of maintaining such a vast and diffused network. Uruk's expansion relied on complex trade routes and administrative oversight, stretching over hundreds and thousands of kilometers. Protecting these routes, ensuring the loyalty of distant outposts, and managing the flow of goods and information would have required immense resources and a constant, vigilant effort, as communication and travel were slow and arduous in the ancient world. The further away an outpost was, the harder it would have been for Uruk to exert direct control or provide timely support. Think of it like trying to manage a sprawling empire with no internet, no telephones, and messengers who travel on foot or by donkey. It becomes incredibly inefficient and prone to break down. Furthermore, it's plausible that internal factors within Uruk itself contributed to the decline. Perhaps the strains of supporting such a large urban population and funding continuous monumental construction projects became too great. Resource depletion in the immediate vicinity of Uruk or changes in the course of the Euphrates could have put pressure on the city's agricultural base. While not explicitly documented, internal political strife or shifts in leadership could also have diverted resources and attention away from maintaining the distant expansion. There's always the possibility that the priest kings just decided they had enough on their plates at home. The scholarly debate here often centers on whether the decline of the Uruk expansion was a sign of fundamental weakness or simply a natural retrenchment. Some argue that Uruk had overextended itself, becoming too thin on the ground, making it vulnerable to local resistance and the rising power of newly emerging centers. Others suggest that the expansion was incredibly successful in its goal of establishing connections and securing resources, and that its retraction merely signifies a shift from direct control to a more